My mom told me to put it in because she said my breath smelled like coffee. So, the first two chapters of Job, they go hand in hand. To kind of refresh everybody's memory about Job, in the book of Job, I just want to hit a couple of points. It's unknown who the author of Job is. Most theologians say it's either Moses or Solomon, and that they were telling the story after the fact that it happened. The reason is because in a lot of books you'll see where the very first line it says, "I Peter write to you," or "I Paul." It identifies who the writer is, and in Job we don't have that. We know it's not Job that wrote these books because we see throughout, and we'll see throughout this chapter, Job had no knowledge of what was going on. He had no. One theologian I read this week called it ignorance of the situation, and was saying that they didn't foresee this coming, and they didn't have any understanding of why it was happening. Not Job or not anyone else that we see in the book of Job. So we know it wasn't Job that wrote it. We date this book, his lifetime, to be in after Babel and before Abraham. And the reason that we date this is because in the whole book of Job, there's no mention of Abraham or his role in the faith with the Jewish God. So it had to be before Abraham when this happened. So that's what most people believe, most of the great theologians believe, that that's the time frame is after Babel and before Abraham. And we also know that because of how long he lived. It's estimated 200 years. We know that he lived after all his children were taken away, another 140 years. So if he had grown children, he had to have been at least my age or older, which is 40, because I have two teenage children that are both driving now. That's a scary thought. So the estimate is, I got a few nodding their head back there. The estimate is about 200 years old. So that kind of catches us up. And when we see in the first part of chapter 1, which I'm not going to cover these verses, the first 5 verses, it describes Job. And I'm going to give a brief description of Job. He was a wealthy man. So if we looked at in today's times, compared to the way the Bible describes Job in that day, he would probably be on the level of a Bill Gates in wealth. The way that it describes his wealth, he's pretty wealthy for that time. And it said that he had 10 children. So he had lived a good life up to this point. And that's what we're going to pick up, because what we're going to look at is the similarities between chapter 1 and chapter 2 and how it relates to us today. So we'll start with verse 6 and 7. And the first point, there's 5 points of the first 2 books of Job that we have to understand. There's 5 themes that I picked out that we're going to talk about today. And the first one is that Satan walks among us. And sometimes we lose sight of that Satan actually walks among us on this earth, and the Bible tells us that. It says, verse 6 and 7, one day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord asked Satan, "Where have you come from?" "From roaming through the earth," Satan answered him, "and walking around on it." So we see right there, that's in chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. God asked Satan, "Where have you come from?" Does that mean that God didn't know where Satan was? Absolutely not. It's to teach us. God knew where Satan was, and Satan answered because he would know that God would know. And he said, "I've been walking on the earth." So the Bible tells us that Satan's among us, walking on this earth. And we flip over to chapter 2, and we see in verse 1 and 2, we see the same thing. One day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord asked Satan, "Where have you come from?" "From roaming through the earth," Satan answered him, "and walking around on it." So even in chapter 2, these are 2 different interactions with God that Satan had. 2 different times. In both times, Satan answered the question the same way, that he was walking around on earth. And when we think about that, we see all the trials that we face in life, and we see all the negativity today going on. Satan has a huge control in this world today. He has a grasp on things, and he's misleading people and misguiding people probably stronger than any of us have ever seen in our lifetime, I'd venture to say. But we're going to come to understand that even though Satan has control at times, he has no power unless God allows him to have it. And we're going to see that here in just a minute. So even though Satan walks among us, and we're going to see the trials and the tribulations that he puts Job through, we have to understand that he can't do anything unless God allows it. So the second point of this, after we understand that Satan is among us, is that God has faith in his believers. This is a huge point for me. When I was studying this week, and I've touched on this before in a Bible study, but it really jumped out at me that God has faith in us. You know, when you think about that as a question, and you put it into perspective of yourself, does God have faith in me? It's a good question for us to ask ourselves. And we're going to see here in these next couple verses that God does have faith. It says in chapter 1, we'll pick up again in verse 8, "Then the Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man perfect integrity, a man of perfect integrity, who fears God and turns away from evil.' Satan answered the Lord, 'Does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you placed a hedge around him, his household, and everything he owns? You have blessed the work of his hands and of his possessions, and have increased it in land.'" I went too far. If we flip over to chapter 2, we're going to see the same thing again in verse 3. "Then the Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man perfect of perfect integrity, who fears God and turns away from evil. He still retains his integrity, even though you incited me against him to destroy him for no good reason.'" So, in the first interaction that we see, God is bragging on Job to Satan. He's saying, "Have you seen this man, Job? He's mine. I have him. I have his dedication to me. There's nothing you can do to take him away from me. That he lives a God-fearful life." That's the first interaction. In the second interaction, we see not only does God say that same thing again about Job, he reiterates, "After you had me incite me against him." In chapter 2, it says, "He still retains his integrity, even though you incited me against him to destroy him for no good reason." So this is after the fact of the first trials that Job faced. The first time that God allowed Satan to put him through persecution. So we know that in itself tells us that Satan didn't do anything, because God says, "Even though you incited me against him," which means God had to allow the things to happen. So it's God's will for things to happen. And we face that in life today. One of the great questions about Job is, why do people go through these great trials? Why do people suffer? Why do Christian people or people of faith suffer great trials? Why aren't we just blessed all the time? Well, sometimes we are blessed and sometimes we're not. And that's one of the great things about having faith, is that no matter what happens to us here, we have to understand that God has a plan for our life. And if you read the whole book of Job, you see this plan lay out. And it's the same way for us. God works through these trials for a reason. So I think it's encouraging to know that we see that God has faith in the people who has faith in him, that he's willing to let us be tempted by Satan, let us have trials by Satan, because he believes in us. The fact that our God in heaven has faith in us and faith in me blows me away. This is the creator of all things. But yet he has faith in me. It took me away this week, and I have studied this before, and I have taught this before, and I always tell people, every time you can read a book 100 times, you're going to learn something new every time. And I was blown away about the fact that God taught me that he had faith in me, that he has faith in his believers. And that was an encouraging thing to learn this week. The third point from these first two chapters that we see is Satan's reasons that Job would fail. And we're going to flip back to chapter 1. And I already kind of spilled the beans on that a little bit. But we'll start in verse 9. Satan answered the Lord, does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you placed a hedge around him, his household, and everything he owns? A hedge in that day would have been like a security wall. It would be a way to keep things out. So it was security is what he's saying. You've give him a fence. You've give him, anything we would consider keeping safe. And that's what Satan is saying to God. He says, you have blessed the work of his hands and his possessions and have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he owns, and he will surely curse you to your face. So Satan is telling God, yeah, like I said in an earlier description, in that day, Job would have been to the equivalent of a very wealthy person of our day. And, of a Bill Gates or someone who's very, very extremely wealthy and well known. Job was well known. We see that in the very first part of chapter 1 when it talks about him. He's well known. And so Satan's saying, yeah, but if you take all those riches away from him, he'll curse you. He'll deny you. He won't be your loyal servant if you take everything he has. And I thought that was relevant for today because how many of us know somebody because of this coronavirus over the last year that financially has had some kind of downfall or some kind of pain? I know myself, I have faced times where there was worry over how I was going to cover things. And I know that I'm not the only one out there that has faced that fear. There's businesses that don't know if they're going to be able to make it to the end of this. A good one that pops in mind is our local theater in Winchester up on the square has been closed for months. But then people still have to pay the bills on that business. But they've got no revenue coming in because they can't have anybody in the building. Or restaurants, took a hard hit because people used to go out to eat all the time and people just ain't doing it as much as they used to because of this. And so that's Satan's way of tempting those people or trying those people to have them turn against God. And that's what he's saying to God. You take everything away from somebody, they'll curse you. They'll curse you to your face, which is a gutsy statement on Satan's part to God. But we see the same thing in chapter 2. If you flip back over chapter 2 in verses 4 and 5. Skin for skin, Satan answered the Lord. A man will give up everything he owns in exchange for his life. But stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. So Satan's saying, yeah, after he tried to take everything away from Job, and Job stood fast in his belief in God, and his faith in God, and his devotion to God, Satan's like, yeah, well, you took everything, but you left him healthy. You didn't strike him down. And all of us can relate to that. Everybody in here at one time or another has faced a physical ailment of some sort and knows the discomfort of being sick or having an injury or having something physically wrong with them in life. And so Satan's saying to God, yeah, strike his health down and then he'll curse you. He'll denounce you then. So these are Satan's reasonings that Job would fail to God, because Satan wants to prove to God that he's smarter than God, even though we all know he's not. And we all know in the end God's going to win because the Bible tells us. That's Satan's burning desire to be better than God. And he's trying to prove that God's believers won't stay believers if they go through these trials. And so God allows Job to be tested on both fronts. The first time, God allowed him to be tested by his fortune, because that was Satan's reasoning. And on the second, he allows him to be tested through his health. So we're going to look at those tests now, and that's the fourth point of this message, is that God allows Satan to test us. So we'll look back in chapter 1, verses 12 through 19. Bear with me because this is a lot, but this is the first time that Job was tested. Very well, the Lord told Satan, everything he owned is in your power. However, do not lay a hand on Job himself. So Satan left the Lord's presence. One day when Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and reported, while the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, the Sabeans swooped down and took them away. They struck down the servants with the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. He was still speaking when another messenger came and reported, God's fire fell from heaven. It burned the sheep and the servants and devoured them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. That messenger was still speaking when yet another came and reported, the Chaldeans from 3 bands made a raid on the camels and took them away. They struck down the servants with the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. He was still speaking when another messenger came and reported, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. Suddenly, a powerful wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on the young people so that they died, and I alone have escaped to tell you. This is the first trial. You look at this is from a financial standpoint. This has nothing to do with Job's physical health. Probably has a lot to do with his mental health at this point. But think about this day. He's standing there talking, and a servant walks up and tells him about the first bad news, right? And before this servant ever leaves him, here comes a second servant to give him even more bad news. While that one's still speaking, here comes a third servant to give him more bad news. And finally, while that one's still speaking, a fourth servant comes to tell him about his children. I think to myself, have we had those days where we just feel like everything's falling apart? Right? I know I have. I know everybody in my family has, because I've heard them talk about them at one time or another, where it never fails. Every time the phone rings, something's wrong. Your car won't start. Something bad has happened, and it seems like it happens all day long. That's what Job experienced to such a dramatic degree. And we'll see Job's reaction to this in just a few moments. But just take in the gravity of this day that he had. It's not, my car wouldn't start, and then I found out that somebody took money out of my bank account, and then I found out that, one of my children got suspended from school, and just things piling on. That's normal. He's lost everything he had, even his 10 children. And we know that God played a part in this, because what did it say in some of the instances? It said, 2 of them, it said that fire rained down from the heavens. That is God power. Satan doesn't have that power. He's only allowed to use the power that God allows him. And then it says that winds hit the 4 walls of his oldest son's house. When have you ever felt wind blowing from 4 directions at the same time? I mean, I've lived through hurricanes and tornadoes, and it still blows in one direction. When I was a kid, we lived through Hurricane Hugo, and North Carolina destroyed everything around us except our house and the neighbor's house. He had 1 twig in the yard. Remember that? The man had 1 twig. Everybody else had trees down there where he had 1 little twig. He must have really been connected to God real well. And then my daughters and I in Hazel Green, Alabama, a tornado went right in front of our house that we were at, and it was a scary situation. But the wind only blew from one side in both those incidents. Do what? Yeah, on her birthday, we had a tornado go through. But it didn't come from all angles. So we know that's godly power for the wind to blow in all four walls at the same time. We flip over to chapter 2. We're going to see the second time he was tested in verses 6 through 8. And we know that Satan had said skin for skin, talking about Job's health. So God answered him very well, the Lord told Satan. He said, in your power, only spare his life. So Satan left the Lord's presence, infected Job with terrible boils from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery to scrape himself while he sat among the ashes. I don't know. This one I relate to very well. I have a skin disorder. My daughter has it, not nearly as bad as I do. My mother had it. Her dad had it. My sister has it. It itches and it hurts, burns, and so I can relate to having a skin problem. And they're talking about boils. Boils would be like if you burned yourself. If you've ever burned yourself on hot water grease and that boil pops up from the burn, that's what a boil is. And he's covered from the bottom of his feet to the top of his head. Can you imagine the discomfort, the burning, the itching, the pain that he was going through at this time? He had to have been miserable. God allowed Satan to test him physically, but said, don't take his life. So that's why it's just boils, because he wasn't allowed to take Job's life. God didn't allow that. But he placed this awful skin problem on Job that he suffered with. And so to think about that, we have to kind of put it in the terms of that day, which if we would see later when Job's friends showed up, we would see their reaction to the fact that he's covered these bulls. In that day, people would have assumed that you had sinned against God if you were facing something to this degree. So Job not only has lost everything, and now he's lost his health, and he's got to be wondering himself, what did I do? What sin have I committed to have caused all this to come on me? But that's not how he reacted. But when studying this, you have to put it into our perspective, and it's got to make you think. How would we react to this? How would we react if we lost everything financially and then we were attacked physically with something? And today a lot of people face that. I've got friends that have cancer or kidney disease, or they have a loved one that has dementia. I have a grandfather that has Parkinson's, who is a form of dementia and has more trouble at night than during the day. So everybody knows someone who's facing something physically, but what if that person not only was facing that physical trial, but they had lost everything they had in the same day or around the same time period? And what must they be thinking? And we can look at things that way, and then we can step into Job's shoes, and we can say, how would we react to God? If we truly love God, and we truly believe in Jesus Christ, how would we react to these situations? I think that's the reason for this book, the book of Job, is for us to see how we are supposed to react to situations. And that's the fifth point of this message today. We're going to look at Job's response to these trials. That's the last point of this message. We're going to look at how Job responds. So if we flip back to chapter 1, we're going to look at verses 20 and 22, 20 through 22. And this was right after the 4 trials. One messenger after another coming to him, telling him he lost all his servants, he lost all his animals, he lost all his children. You notice it doesn't mention anything about gold and silver, because in that day, that's not how wealth was designed. They didn't use precious metals in that day. You were wealthy by your your livestock and your crop and what you had. And so this is Job's response, starting in verse 20. Then Job stood up, tore his robe, and shaved his head, and fell to the ground and worshipped, saying, Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will leave this life. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That's the most powerful verses in the first chapter of Job. We just saw how he was attacked. Just that barrage, that onslaught of trials, just coming at him from every angle. And his response was, he stood up, tore his robe. In that day, that was a symbol of the Jewish time. You would tear your robe in grief to show God that you understand. It was a symbolic, the kind of the way we look at things today when we take the Lord's Supper or we do baptism. It's a symbolic of our belief. It's why we do it. This is the same thing when he tears his robe and shaves his head. And then he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will leave this life. What he's saying was, I didn't have anything when I was born, and so I won't have anything when I leave. And he understood that. No matter how much wealth that we acquire in this life, we can't take it with us. It doesn't matter. And Job understood that. So then he went on to say, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Job understood that everything he has comes from God. Everything. And we lose sight of that at times. You know, we're quick to pray when we have something going on in our life. We're real quick to pray as Christians when someone tells us that, you know, a loved one is sick or a friend is having trouble, and we pray to God, and we should. But how often do we just say, thank you for the blessings that we have? Thank you, God, for everything you give me. Thank you for the fact that I have electricity or food in my refrigerator, gas in my gas tank. Just thank you, God. And Job understands that everything he had come from God. And he said, and the Lord takes away. He understood that God was the one that took it all away from him. He had to have. When you talk about fire raining down from the heavens and wind hitting from four directions, he knew that had to be a sign from God. He didn't know why, but he knew that it had God, that God was in control. His faith was so strong in God and that God is in control of everything. He had no doubt where these trials came from. And the last thing he says here in chapter 1 is, blessed be the name of the Lord. So he did the exact opposite of what Satan said. What did Satan say? You take everything from him and he'll curse your name to his face, right? That's what Satan said. Job did the exact opposite of what Satan said. He didn't curse God. He said, blessed be the name of the Lord. He did the exact opposite. So when we look over in chapter 2, verses 6 through 8, we're going to see how he responds to the second trial, the trial of his health. I went too far. 9 and 10. Verse 9 and 10. I'm going to back up just a little bit to verse 8. And then Job took a piece of broken pottery to scrape himself while he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die. You speak as a foolish woman speaks, he told her. Should we accept only good from God and not adversity? Throughout all this, Job did not sin in what he said. So let's take a look at that. First of all, I backed up just a little bit so we could see the part about him sitting in the ashes. This was a response to what was going on. In that day, the Jewish people, if you had leprosy, boils, if a woman was going through her menstrual cycle, you were considered unclean in the eyes of God if you had something like that going on. And what it means when he's sitting in the ashes, they didn't have dumps the way we have them today. Anything that they discarded, they had in an area and they would burn it. And there would just be ashes. And that's where Job went. He went to an unclean place because he felt unclean. So it's an understanding that those boils made him unclean from the perspective of his belief in God in that day, in the tradition. That's why I backed up just a little bit so you'd understand why he sat in ashes. And then we see his wife. I believe that Satan placed these words on his wife's lips to say to him. Because if you backtrack a little bit, you know that Job was wealthy. They had 10 kids. They had to have a love for each other to have 10 kids. I have 2. And if I had 10, that'd be a lot. So 2's enough, I promise you. So there had to be a strong love between this man and woman to get to the point to have 10 kids. Will we all venture to agree on that? And so to me, I feel like Satan placed these words on her heart. And she said, his wife said to him, "Are you still holding to your integrity? Curse God and die." What did Satan say to God? He will curse you to your face. And then she says the same thing. And I believe that Satan placed this on her lips to say the same thing, to try to encourage Job to do what Satan set out to have Job do. Right? That's not what Job did. He said, "You speak as a foolish woman speaks," he told her. "Should we accept only good from God and not adversity?" Throughout all this, Job did not sin in what he said. Think about that. How hard would it, us men, how hard would it be able to look at your wife and say, "You foolish woman"? A lot of us be fearful that we'd get a frying pan upside the head or be sleeping on the couch, right? But without a doubt, that's what he said. I see a lot of women looking at their husbands. So, but then he told her, he said, "Should we only accept good and not the adversity?" God, Job understood that we saw it in the first chapter. He said, "God giveth and God taketh away." And in this chapter, he said, should we only accept good, which is the giving part of God? Should we only accept those riches and those rewards and those blessings that he gives us and not the adversity he gives us? He understood that we have to accept everything that God brings in our life because God has a plan. And then it says, throughout all this, Job did not sin in what he said. So Job never wavered in his belief. So when we look back, we learned in these first 2 chapters, and I do think they go hand in hand because it's the 2 trials of Job, the financial trial and the physical trial, the interaction with Satan and God in both. It mirrors each other all the way through. And I feel like it's relevant to us today because many of us are facing trials. We're facing major changes in our life. And we're fearful. We don't know how things are going to go. But we have to be like Job in his response. So we see the 5 things. Satan walks among us. We know that because the Bible tells us he does. So when we see all these things, when we see these reports on the news and about people rioting or people being killed innocently or businesses that are getting shut down because of what's going on in coronavirus and all this fear and turmoil that not just us, but the world is facing today, we have to understand where that comes from. God allows Satan to test us. But then the second point that I mentioned was that God had faith in Job and his believers. So we have to understand that God would not allow Satan to test us unless he believed in us and that he believed that we would stand firm. I had a theologian that I read this week said that one of the major themes of the book of Job is that it shows that if you're truly one with God, that nothing can take you away from him. You know, there's a big debate about once saved, always saved. And we see here that if God has faith that you can't be plucked from him, Jesus even said that, that once he has his hands on you, that you can't be taken away from him. God showed that in Job. He had so much faith in Job, he pointed Job out to Satan and said, "Here, do you see Job? He has unmatched integrity. He is mine and you can't take him away from me." It's great to know that God has that faith in us. It allows us to have the strength we need to go through the trials that we face. Number 3, we saw the reasons that Satan gave that we would fail. And from a human perspective, we can understand that, right? We can definitely understand from a human standpoint why somebody would fail in those situations. But what we have to understand is that God is greater than our human capacity. And He knows all. And He has a reason for all. No matter what it is, even if it's not humanly what we love, desire, or think is good, it benefits God in some way. And He has a plan. Number 4, the fourth point is that God allows Satan to test us. We have to understand that Satan has no power over us unless God allows him to do these things. Which means we don't have to worry about Satan because it's God. And if we love God, then we just have to understand, as parents, we had to punish our children, right? It's not our favorite thing to do, but we had to do it. I know I got punished. I can promise you, my mama's here, she'll vouch for it. I got plenty of punishment when I was a kid. And I have my daughter here, she'll tell you I'm quick to get them if they get out of line. But we have to understand that even though God punishes us, He has a plan. And just like when we were children, when our parents punished us, we didn't understand. We didn't understand sometimes. We knew what they said the reason was, but it didn't make sense in our heads if you think back why they were so upset. And the fifth part was Job's response. And the most important part of this message is how Job responded and how we should respond. How we should respond to these trials that we face today when something happens. When we have a loved one who has cancer, or we lose our financial standing in life. No matter what it is that God allows us to go through, we have to keep our faith in Him. We have to keep our faith in Christ, and we have to remember the promises that God gave us. I'll give you a good example of why trials happen. And that's a major theme of Job, is why do good people face bad things, right? I'll give you a good example. I have a cousin who had a stepdaughter who died of cancer. She was 16 or 17? So right around there, 15. Looking from closely, it's why is this poor young girl going through cancer? Why did she die from cancer, right? When you look at it from a close perspective, because she was a sweet girl, really was a sweet girl, and everybody adored her. And that's hard to understand. But when you look back from the outside, when they had her funeral, they were lined up. It took hours to have all the people go through. And there were all these kids and their families, and some families of kids who had passed away as well, who showed up to her funeral to tell her mother and my cousin Dale that the impact she made on their family or on their child because of the encouraging words that she said to them. The reason I'm bringing this up is because looking back, you can see God's plan. Is it great that she died of cancer? No, absolutely not. But you see the work that God worked through her trials. And today we face so much uncertainty, and we think, why are we going through this? We may not know why, but there's some reason that God has a plan, just as with this young girl passing away with cancer. And there's several other stories like that jump out of my head. But anytime, if you ever have that doubt, try to step back and think, why is God using this? How is God using this? He has a plan. But if we are His believers, we will do the same as Job. When we are faced by trials, we'll say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Or we'll say things like, should we accept only good from God and not adversity? We have to keep our faith in God no matter what He sends our way. I thank y'all for letting me speak today. Do you want to come up and lead the invitation? If anybody needs to be prayed with, please come forward. The altar's open. If you have a need, you can let me know, or Mr. Jim. I appreciate y'all letting me be here tonight. Tonight I'll be speaking on Matthew chapter 4. and Jesus being tempted. So we're going to see how Jesus responded to Satan's temptation. So I thank y'all for allowing me to be here.